Christians are constantly attacking the separation of church and state, and we're constantly debunking their claims. In this video, I'm going to address some of the specific fact claims that are historically and factually wrong.
Almost everyone has heard of the doctrine of the separation of church and state. Most Americans believe that it's in the United States Constitution. But there is no such phrase in the Constitution.
Did you know a recent poll demonstrated that 67% of Americans believe the phrase separation of church and state is found in the First Amendment of the Constitution?
The poll by the First Amendment Center actually asked if, quote, the First Amendment requires a clear separation of church and state. The poll does not ask if the phrase is there, nor are the people who respond to the poll saying that the phrase is in the Constitution. His statement, which he's been making for many years, is just the start of the deception.
That phrase isn't found in the First Amendment in the Constitution. It's not found anywhere in the Constitution. It doesn't appear anywhere.
So where does that phrase come from? It comes from one brief letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802.
Well, Pastor, then how did we so pervert this wall of separation? When did it become the foundational principle of our judiciary? Did you know the first time the United States Supreme Court ever mentioned the separation of church and state was in 1947, 150 years after the ratification of the First Amendment?
No, not 150 years, but 83 years after the First Amendment. The case is Reynolds versus the United States in 1879. In this case, a Mormon was convicted of bigamy and child sex. In this case, he contended that it was a violation of his First Amendment rights since his Mormon religion required him to take multiple wives. The court quoted extensively from the Danbury Baptist letter, including the wall of separation between church and state. They ruled that as Jefferson had written it, it then, quote, it may be accepted almost as an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of the amendment, end quote. They then used Jefferson's words in that letter as follows: the legitimate powers of the government reach actions only and not opinions, and ruled that the laws against child sex and bigamy were regulating actions and not religious beliefs. Therefore, his First Amendment religious freedom was not infringed. Now, it is possible that Jeffress and Prager are unaware of this ruling, but let's see.
First 226 years of our nation's history, our judiciary understood that marriage was a special relationship between one man and one woman. In 1885, in the Supreme Court case of Murphy versus Ramsey, the High Court said, what could be more wholesome or necessary than that legislation would seize a family as consisting in and springing from the union of one man and one woman in the holy estate of matrimony.
It is noteworthy that there is a Wikipedia article on the Reynolds case, but not on the Murphy versus Ramsey case. But a search for Murphy versus Ramsey shows that it is a First Amendment case. In fact, it is also a case involving Mormon bigamy. In Murphy, the court upheld a law that removed voting rights from those Mormons who practiced bigamy. This case is described as affirming the Reynolds case 6 years earlier, so Jeffress can find the relatively obscure Murphy case because it mentions one man and one woman in marriage, but he supposedly is unaware of the Reynolds case, even though articles on the legal effect of Murphy state that it is to reaffirm the Reynolds case upholding federal laws against polygamy. Let's see if Prager does any better.
He uses the phrase, building a wall of separation between church and state. And that's where the phrase lived, undisturbed, lost in Jefferson's voluminous correspondence for almost 150 years.
No, it was not lost or forgotten by historians or the courts. It was not obscure. They are piling on the lie that this metaphor, wall of separation, was not law until godless humanists inserted it in the mid-20th century. In fact, it was in a Supreme Court ruling 83 years after ratification of the Bill of Rights, 68 years before the Everson case of 1947, and it is described by the Supreme Court as almost an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of the amendment. Moreover, it was used in rulings that did not allow people to use religion as an excuse to do things that were otherwise illegal.
It was the first time it was ever mentioned. It was in a well-known case, Everson versus the Board of Education. And in this landmark case, the Supreme Court said it is illegal for New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, to use tax dollars to support a private parochial religious school.
This is not true. In fact, the court ruled that the tax subsidy to transport children to Catholic schools was not a violation of the Establishment Clause, though it did reaffirm a wall of separation. But why would he lie other than just habit? I mean, it's Sunday, he's in the pulpit, I guess it's time to start lying. But seriously, he has a motive to tell this fiction.
Now think with me for a moment. Back in 1947, all religious schools were basically of one faith. What faith was it? They were Catholic schools, all right? They were Catholic schools, and the United States Supreme Court said that we can't support Catholic schools. The man who wrote the court opinion was Justice Hugo Black. Quote, "You can't understand the period when Justice Black was on the court without understanding the fear that American elites had of Catholic influence and power." Justice Hugo Black was an ex-member of the Ku Klux Klan. And if you know anything about the Ku Klux Klan, you will know the only people they hated worse than African Americans were Catholics. And thus, when Justice Hugo Black talked about the wall of separation from church and state, it was his anti-Catholic bias pouring out.
Well, there you have it. This is his motive. He wants to equate, in fact, he does equate separation of church and state with bigotry. He repeatedly promotes the supremacy of the Christian religion over all others in this country, and he wants to make all non-Christians second-class citizens in their own country. But he portrays the idea that when the government treats all religions equally, all religious opinions equally, it is motivated by bigotry. If we don't submit to Christian rule as the law of the land, then we are persecuting them because we are bigots.
Washington's view remained the nation's view throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. But that changed in 1947. In that year, in the case of Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that under the First Amendment, neither a state nor the federal government could pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. For the first time in American history, the First Amendment was not only about the prohibition of establishing a national religion, it was also about not giving any encouragement to any religion. The modern strict separation view was born.
But what exactly does this ruling do? Christian nationalists often call this a 5-4 ruling, but the first part of the ruling where the court ruled that there is a wall of separation between church and state was unanimous among all 9 justices. The second part of the ruling was 5-4 in favor of the Catholics, saying that paying for the transportation of kids to parochial schools was not a violation of that wall. The Reynolds case, which originally ruled the wall of separation 68 years earlier, only addressed the federal law. Utah was a territory, and the issue of states being required to respect the First Amendment rights was not addressed. This case, Everson, did address states. In fact, the first thing you see when searching for Everson versus Board of Education is exactly that. It incorporates the 14th Amendment to the First Amendment wall of separation. In fact, the summary in Wikipedia clearly spells out that the ruling is about the states must follow the First Amendment Establishment Clause that originally applied only to Congress and the federal government. The 14th Amendment requires states to respect all rights guaranteed by the federal government, but they had largely ignored this, regularly giving special treatment to various religious groups and viewpoints. This is the core of the ruling, yet Prager and Jeffress somehow miss this point, just as they miss the Reynolds case altogether. While Christian nationalists rant about the Everson ruling constantly, just as they do about their Bible, they don't seem to actually read either one. If they did, they would see that the text of the ruling references Reynolds. The ruling on Everson references Reynolds versus the United States 68 years early. If they ever read the Bible, they would also see that it says to treat others the way you want to be treated. They rarely do that.
And where did the 5 justices look for support for their argument? Not the Constitution, because there was nothing in the Constitution to help them, but to that one phrase Thomas Jefferson wrote back in 1802.
They referred to the First Amendment, the Reynolds ruling, and the 14th Amendment.
2 current members of the Supreme Court agree. Justices Thomas and Scalia have both argued that this rabid desire to build this wall to protect sectarian groups from government was founded upon anti-Catholic bigotry. Justice Clarence Thomas said, quote, "It was an open secret that sectarian was a code for Catholic. This doctrine of separation of church and state, born of bigotry, should be buried now."
This quote has been doctored. The correct quote from Justice Thomas is, "This doctrine, born of bigotry, should be buried now." The wall of separation is not in the quote. The reference in the Mitchell case was to Blaine amendments that allowed tax money to private secular schools, but not to religious ones. YouTuber TMM addresses other claims made by this Prager video in his video titled PragerU Doesn't Like Separation of Church and State. I've addressed other claims made by Jeffress in the video series Dr. Jeffress, America is a Christian Nation Debunked. I also recommend this Prager University video on why lying is a bad thing.